On May 10, 2002, the state of Alabama strapped a woman into its infamous electric chair, a battered wooden seat known as Yellow Mama. She became the first woman executed in Alabama in nearly half a century. The woman's name was Lynda Lyon Block, and before she became a convicted cop killer, she had lived a life full of contradictions. Civic leader and animal rights advocate on one hand, but also a fugitive from justice and a believer in radical ideologies that placed her in direct conflict with the law. This is the story of how a Florida woman transformed from respected community member to one of the most infamous names on Alabama's death row. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. Lynda Cheryl Lyon was born on February 8, 1948, in Orlando, Florida. At first glance, her life could have been ordinary, the kind of childhood that leads to a normal adult life. But beneath the surface, things were not so simple. When Lynda was just 10 years old, tragedy struck her family. Her father, Francis Stephen Lyon, died suddenly of heart failure. For a young child, losing a father figure at such a crucial age can create a wound that never truly heals. For Lynda, this loss left her emotionally vulnerable, and it forever shaped the way she saw authority, trust, and family. Her relationship with her mother, Berilyn Elizabeth Owen, was nothing short of toxic. She would later claim that her mother was both physically and mentally abusive, creating a home environment that was not nurturing, but instead filled with tension, fear, and resentment. She grew up not only with grief, but with hostility within her own home. Psychologists often point to early trauma as a seedbed for later rebellion or distrust of institutions. In Lynda's case, the combination of an absent father and an abusive mother may have hardened her outlook on life and authority. It's important to understand this backdrop, because later, when she rejected the authority of the government, refused to recognize the power of the courts, and even destroyed her own Social Security card, these actions weren't random. They were consistent with a life that began in mistrust and rebellion. But her early years weren't all defined by hardship. Lynda was bright, charismatic, and had the ability to connect with people. These traits would later allow her to thrive in civic life and community leadership. However, charisma combined with deep inner turmoil can be a dangerous mix, one that draws people in, but also pulls them into chaos. As she entered adulthood, Lynda seemed to be searching for stability, but the way she sought it would foreshadow the turbulence ahead. For a period of time, Lynda Lyon Block seemed like the perfect example of a woman who cared about her community. In Key West, Florida, she became deeply involved in civic and social causes. She wasn't just a passive participant, she took on leadership roles. She worked with the Humane Society, not just as a volunteer, but serving as secretary. She even became an animal abuse investigator, showing a willingness to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She was active in local politics. She served as president of the Friends of the Library in Key West for 2 years. She also worked as the publicity director for a mayoral candidate. On the outside, she looked like a woman dedicated to making the world better, a community servant, a voice for change. Her second husband, George Sibley, later claimed that charity was a constant trait of Lynda's character. According to him, she had compassion, empathy, and a sense of responsibility towards others. But here's where the contradictions start to appear. At the very same time she was giving back to the community, Lynda was also developing a deep mistrust of government and authority. She wasn't just politically active, she was politically radical. She launched her own political magazine, Liberatus. This wasn't a standard civic newsletter. It was filled with anti-government rhetoric, skepticism about authority, and hints of the extremist ideology she and George Sibley would later embrace fully. This dual life is one of the most fascinating aspects of Lynda's story. To the casual observer, she was a well-meaning community activist. But beneath the surface, she was hardening into a person who saw the government not as a partner, but as an enemy. It raises an important question. Was Lynda truly charitable and caring? Or was she using her civic involvement as a mask, a way to blend in while she slowly drifted further into dangerous ideas? Before we continue deeper into Lynda's unraveling story, a quick reminder: if you're finding this case as fascinating and disturbing as we are, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. That way you'll never miss the hidden stories we bring to light here on Death Row Diaries. Now, let's move on to the turning point in Lynda's life, an attack that would send her running from the law. By the early 1990s, Lynda's personal life was in chaos. After divorcing her much older first husband, Carl Block, her relationship with him didn't end quietly. Instead, it turned toxic, violent, and eventually criminal. In August 1992, Lynda and George Sibley broke into Carl's apartment. This wasn't just a family dispute, it was a full-blown attack. They forced Carl into a chair. They gagged him. They stabbed him in the chest. Imagine that for a moment. A woman who had once been a respected figure in Key West was now tying up and stabbing her ex-husband. It's worth noting that Carl wasn't just any man. He was 80 years old, a military veteran, and someone who had already endured the loss of his own son in a car crash. The brutality of the attack made the crime even more shocking. Neighbors eventually discovered Carl and alerted authorities. Lynda and Sibley were arrested and charged with aggravated battery on someone over the age of 65. In court, they entered a plea of no contest, essentially not fighting the charge. A sentencing date was scheduled, but when that date came, they never showed up. Instead, they vanished. This was the beginning of their life as fugitives. They were no longer civic activists. They were no longer community leaders. They were now on the run, avoiding accountability and descending further into paranoia. As fugitives, Lynda and George embraced a radical belief system that put them squarely at odds with society. They didn't just want to evade justice, they wanted to reject it entirely. They became part of what is often referred to as the sovereign citizen movement, an anti-government ideology rooted in the belief that the United States government has no legitimate authority. They renounced their U.S. citizenship. They destroyed their birth certificates, driver's licenses, and Social Security cards. They declared that the government had no jurisdiction over them. To Lynda and George, the courts had no authority, the police had no power, and the laws of the United States didn't apply. They weren't just running from the law anymore, they were actively defying it. And they weren't quiet about it either. Their magazine, Liberatus, became an outlet for their defiance. They wrote articles and spread ideas that rejected the authority of the state. To some, they were radicals. To others, they were dangerous. This defiance would set the stage for what happened next, because eventually their path would collide with that of a police officer in Alabama, and that encounter would turn deadly. Don't forget, drop a comment below. Do you think Lynda's early trauma and abuse played a role in her path toward extremism, or was she destined to spiral down this path regardless? By the fall of 1993, Lynda Lyon Block and George Sibley had been fugitives for over a year. They were constantly on the move, wary of law enforcement, and deeply entrenched in their anti-government beliefs. On October 4, 1993, their path crossed with that of Sergeant Roger Motley, Jr., an Opelika, Alabama police officer. What began as a routine moment in a Walmart parking lot would spiral into a deadly exchange of gunfire. That day, Lynda's 9-year-old son was sitting inside their car with Sibley. Lynda herself was at a nearby payphone. To an ordinary passerby, something didn't look right. A concerned woman spotted the boy in the car and thought he seemed distressed, even as if he might be silently asking for help. She also suspected the family might be living out of the vehicle. Out of concern, she approached Sergeant Motley, who happened to be nearby. Motley did what any officer would do. He went to check on the situation. He approached the car and asked George Sibley for his driver's license. For most people, this would be a standard interaction. But for Sibley, steeped in sovereign citizen ideology, this was an affront. Instead of complying, Sibley launched into his personal theories that he wasn't legally required to have a license. Witnesses later testified that the tension escalated quickly. Motley placed his hand near his weapon, perhaps sensing the danger. And that was all it took. Sibley drew his gun. Shots rang out. Witnesses claimed Sibley fired first, though in the chaos, details blurred. Motley returned fire, striking Sibley. Meanwhile, at the payphone, Lynda heard the gunshots. She didn't freeze. She didn't run. Instead, she charged toward the scene, gun in hand. Witnesses described her in a crouched position, moving tactically. Motley, already wounded and taking cover behind his patrol car, now faced fire from 2 directions. As he turned toward Lynda, she pulled the trigger. 1 bullet struck him square in the chest. And in that moment, fate sealed his death. Sergeant Motley wasn't wearing his bulletproof vest that day. He had lent it to another officer. Without protection, the wound was fatal. Sibley and Lynda fled the scene, leaving the mortally wounded officer behind. But their escape wouldn't last forever. This was no longer an assault charge or a fugitive case. This was capital murder of a police officer. When Lynda and George were captured, they faced the gravest charge possible: capital murder of a police officer. For most defendants, this would mean cooperating with attorneys, mounting a defense, and hoping for mercy. But not for Lynda and George. True to their sovereign citizen ideology, they refused to cooperate with court-appointed lawyers. In their view, the court itself had no authority. They even argued that Alabama didn't have the legal right to try them, claiming it was never properly readmitted into the Union after the Civil War. To most observers, these arguments were bizarre, even delusional. But to Lynda and George, they were unwavering truths. During the trial, it became clear that witnesses couldn't definitively say who fired the fatal shot, Lynda or Sibley. But under the law, that didn't matter. Both had participated in the deadly assault on Sergeant Motley, and both were held equally responsible. The jury convicted them both of capital murder. The sentence, death. Lynda was sent to Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama, arriving on death row in December 1994. George would follow his own path to death row, but their defiance never waned. Both continued to reject the legitimacy of their convictions, refusing to express remorse. For Lynda, the path was set. She would spend nearly a decade awaiting the ultimate punishment. If you've been following Lynda's story so far, you can see how her defiance and extremist beliefs led her down a path she could never escape. If cases like this fascinate you, stories of crime, punishment, and shocking twists in history, make sure you like this video and share it with others who love true crime. It helps more people discover Death Row Diaries and keeps us bringing you stories the mainstream often leaves untold.
Now, let's move to Lynda's final days, her last hours before meeting Alabama's electric chair. For nearly 8 years, Lynda Lyon Block lived in the shadow of execution. Her prison number was Z575, and her world was confined to a cell in Julia Tutwiler Prison. Life on death row can break people. Some beg for appeals, others cling to religion. Lynda did neither in the conventional sense. She stayed true to her beliefs, showing little outward fear or remorse. On May 10, 2002, her time ran out. That evening, 3 friends visited her for several hours. She also saw a spiritual advisor, though she remained stoic, never revealing cracks in her defiant armor. Unlike many other inmates, she didn't request a special last meal. She also refused to make a final statement. At midnight, she was escorted to the execution chamber at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. The chair waiting for her was infamous, a yellow-painted electric chair nicknamed Yellow Mama, used for nearly 180 executions since 1927. Witnesses described her demeanor as chillingly blank. Alabama Department of Corrections Commissioner Mike Haley later said, "She never displayed any emotion throughout the very end. Her stare was a very blank stare." At 12:01 a.m., the current was switched on. At 12:10 a.m., Lynda was pronounced dead. She was the first woman executed in Alabama since 1957. More than that, she was the last person in the United States to die by electric chair without the option of lethal injection. Her execution marked the end of an era. Within weeks, Alabama officially switched to lethal injection as the primary method of execution. For the family of Sergeant Roger Motley, the execution brought some closure, though not all. His widow, Juanita, had planned to watch Lynda's execution, but couldn't bring herself to stay until the very end. She left the chamber before the switch was pulled. George Sibley followed Lynda 3 years later, executed in 2005. Like Lynda, he went to his death without apology, maintaining his beliefs until the last breath. The case of Lynda Lyon Block remains infamous for several reasons. It highlights the danger of anti-government extremism. It underscores how personal trauma and radical ideology can converge into violence. And it forever tied her name to the history of capital punishment in the United States. Her blank stare in the final moments symbolized her life, unflinching, unrepentant, and unyielding to authority until the very end. Lynda Lyon Block's life is a chilling story of contradictions. A woman who once devoted herself to civic causes, animal welfare, and community service, but who later turned against the very society she once served. Her journey from activist to extremist, from wife to fugitive, and finally from prisoner to executed killer, is a reminder of how ideology and defiance can spiral into destruction. And in a strange twist of history, her death didn't just mark the end of her own story, it also marked the end of the electric chair era in Alabama. So the question remains, was Lynda Lyon Block simply a cold-blooded killer who made her own choices, or was she a product of trauma, abuse, and dangerous beliefs that consumed her? If you found this story as shocking and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to subscribe to Death Row Diaries and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next case we cover. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Was Lynda's fate inevitable, or could her life have taken a different path? Because here on Death Row Diaries, every story is more than just a crime. It's a glimpse into the darkest corners of human choices.